I'd like to welcome everybody to this colloquium sponsored by the Center for Teaching Excellence and the Office of the Provost. I'm Jed Lyons, the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, and today's colloquium is on the general topic of writing across the curriculum. It's part of an initiative we have going on this year that will include a grants program for faculty to participate in small grants to integrate writing in their programs, and another colloquium that's scheduled for January 10th. So if you'd like more information about those, please visit our website at sc.edu/CTE. I would like to introduce Dr. Helen Parkhurst, who is the Associate Provost and Dean of Undergraduate Studies, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jed. I'm delighted to be here this morning. From the time a 3-year-old picks up her crayon and makes the letters in her name dance crazily across the paper to the time a family gathers to write an obituary summation, writing is a fundamental skill which gives voice to a lifetime of human experience and thought. Writing brings the joy of discovery, the stimulation of intellectual discourse, and the communion of shared experience with readers whom we may or may not ever meet. Inside the academy, of course, writing is foundational for teaching and learning. Since the earliest days here at Carolina, we have recognized the importance of effective written and oral communication, and our course of study has reflected that. In the last 2 years, we've had renewed discussion about the importance of writing in the curriculum. Provost Mark Becker called for a review of the general education requirements and asked a team of over 100 faculty to address the question, what should our undergraduates know in the 21st century? The common core of knowledge, skill, and academic experience in the Gen Ed curriculum is essential for our undergrads. And one of the teams in that discussion has been focusing on effective and persuasive communication. It is at that team's invitation that we are all gathered here today. This morning we're privileged to have with us Dr. Neil Lerner to talk about developing a culture of student engagement and writing. Dr. Lerner is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he teaches scientific and technical communication. Prior to his appointment at MIT, he was an English faculty member and Writing Center Director at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. He is a widely published author and co-edits the Writing Center Journal. He is a 3-time recipient of the International Writing Centers Association Outstanding Scholarship Award, and he's currently writing a book on the history of teaching both writing and science via laboratory methods. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker this morning, Dr. Neil Lerner.
I'm suddenly reminded of all those sitcoms that I spent a lot of time watching in the 70s when the character would suddenly be on TV and was sort of, was hum nom 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 nom. I'll try not to do that. Good, my PowerPoints are there. A little bit of background about me. Since I started in this business, I've taught in lots of contexts to many different kinds of students, to Ford automotive technicians, to 18-year-olds fresh out of high school, and to returning adults in rural and urban community colleges and universities, on military bases, and in nuclear power plants in South Carolina, actually, in pharmacy and healthcare curriculums, and now in a science and engineering-focused university. Early on, my goals as a writing teacher were to do for my students what writing had largely done for me, act as a vehicle of personal understanding, as a way of exploring who I was and who I wanted to be. However, as I spend more and more time in these different kinds of classrooms, teaching many different kinds of students, my goals shifted, and I started to see the importance of writing, or of communication more broadly, as a way for students to connect with others in powerful ways. In other words, writing a personal essay was one kind of power, but writing a laboratory report, or a patient chart, or a design report, offered a different kind of power, one that allowed connection into a world of knowledge and ideas that largely was shaped by these very types of communication. The opportunities available to students if they are skilled communicators are many and speak back to the very purpose of higher education. And to me, that's essentially why I'm here. I show you the charge for the task force that's investigating communication at the university. And I wanted to make sure you see these words, and I'll read them to you. Integrating knowledge and service through effective and persuasive communication. Graduates of the University of South Carolina will think, read, write, inquire, and converse critically as citizens in a diverse democratic society. Students will identify and competently use appropriate technology, genre, and media to communicate ideas in conventional, creative, and persuasive ways to varied audiences. Communication and critical thinking skills will be demonstrated in both general education and discipline-specific courses within the greater culture of scholarship at the university. Graduates will use these skills to address issues, problems, and needs of South Carolinians and the broader global society. And I think that provides a wonderful framework for the work that I'm going to do with you here today. And part of that work is what I'm going to have you do. Since I'm going to talk about writing, I thought maybe we could have a brief writing activity. And I was waiting for groans. No groans, that's good. All of you are interested in writing. So if you take out a piece of paper, or borrow one from a neighbor, and I'm only going to give you a very brief amount of time to do this. So what I'd like you to do is list the stepping stones in your history as a writer. In other words, what have been some significant moments, events, influences, people, and I'm only going to give you about 2 minutes to list those. And this can be, you don't have to write at length on any of these, as long as it's meaningful to you to know what you've listed. For the next step, I'm going to make you do a little more extensive writing. And I have to tell you, as someone who's been a writing teacher for over 20 years, my favorite moment is the sound of everybody writing, or typing if it's in a computer-equipped classroom. For the next step, I want you to choose one of the stepping stones that you just listed. If you only have one, that'll be it. And I'm going to have you write nonstop for 3 minutes. This is a very common technique in writing classes. It's to kind of turn off your internal editor and just tap into your content generators. Choose one stepping stone, write for 3 minutes. If you need a starting point, that's always the hardest. You know, what words do I use to start? I'll give you one. It was a time when. And I'll time those 3 minutes. The stone. Choose one, write about it. And what I'd like you to do next is you're going to share your writing with someone in the room. And it could be someone sitting near you, so you don't have to run around too far. This is a non-evaluative sharing. I'd like you to either describe what you wrote or read what you wrote. I'll leave that up to you. And once you heard what your partner has written or said to you, you could just nod and say, that's very nice. You don't need to say good, bad, or indifferent. And spend about no more than 2 minutes per person, so 4 minutes total. So find someone to share with, whether it's someone sitting next to you or swing around back or front or side. Okay, I'm afraid I'll interrupt what will probably be the best part of the morning for you, which was sharing some of your writing with a partner. And I'm going to come back to what you wrote at the end of my talk. But let me just mention that what we did, what I had you do, is a very powerful writing to learn technique that doesn't take very much time. It can be done in classes small and large. For instance, if it was write for 3 minutes about what was the most important thing you heard about this lecture, share it with a partner. Give students a sense to verbalize their process of knowing, and that's very powerful. And I'll come to that as I talk about writing more generally. Before I talk about those kinds of issues, I'm going to go back and talk about history. I think it's important to contextualize the work that's being done here at South Carolina and the work being done in a kind of national conversation about the role of writing in undergraduate instruction. So let me give you some of my sense of this history. I think one way to understand the forces for change in higher education is to view history through what is to me a simple formula. And here's the formula. I'm from MIT, so we're into formulas at MIT. So rising enrollments plus a lack of money has often equaled reform efforts. And I note adding the word efforts here because it doesn't always mean reform, but it means attempts at reform. So starting in the 1890s and continuing well into the 1930s and beyond, college enrollments grew rapidly. For example, from the turn of the century to 1930, the American population grew by 75%, but enrollments in higher education over that time increased by 400%. So there are four primary points at which enrollments surged, and in this slide I'll show you what those are. They're from in the 1870s, in the 1920s, the 1940s, and then again the 1960s. And enrollments were increasingly going up over this period of time. But in each of these four periods compared to the previous decade, there was a huge spike. And since then, enrollments have pretty much leveled off, if not decreased. At each of these 4 points, what's quite interesting is the students were far different from their predecessors. They were more diverse, they were less prepared, they were more driven by education as a clear path to employment rather than for the sake of intellectual gain. And at conversations you sometimes hear now about what students' motives seem to be and that they're perhaps more crass than in previous generations, well, I've read those same conversations starting in the 1890s. A little bit about difference. Focusing on this late 19th, early 20th century period, in that period, those enrolled were no longer simply the wan teens of the captains of industry, or as historian Lawrence Vesey describes this group, a parade of Anglo-Saxon names and pale, freshly scrubbed faces. And I'm trying to remember where I got this image from, and I think it was Yale. I pick on Yale in this talk quite a few times, actually. Instead, by the early 20th century, the children of the immigrants who had recently come to America began banging on the university's doors. There were great immigrant waves of the late 19th, early 20th century, and those generations and their kids were the ones who were responsible for those surges in enrollments. During this time, all subjects, but particularly writing, came to be seen as appropriately a laboratory subject. Writing instruction was institutionalized at many places, and this followed Harvard's lead in the late 19th century when it made composition a required course, first in the junior year and then in the freshman year. The teaching of writing was changing, however, given the new student population that needed to be served. Lecture, memorization, and recitation were no longer adequate and did not respond to the individual needs of a diverse student population. Starting in the 1890s, the teaching of writing was seen as a laboratory subject, requiring hands-on learning, frequent practice, and guided feedback, much as science laboratory learning aimed to do. One of the leaders in this movement was Fred Newton Scott at Michigan, who reported on the teaching practices at his institution in an article in 1894, and I'll just read this quote. The teaching of composition is properly, as soon as I looked at it, it went away. The teaching of composition is properly laboratory work. I confess that I now and then cast envious eyes upon our laboratory of chemistry, with its 10 instructors and its annual expenditure of $10,000, and try to imagine what might be done in a rhetorical laboratory with an equal force and a fraction of the expenditure. And what's interesting in my study of the history of teaching science is actually science, it was a fairly new endeavor, and the expense being put forth towards science in the 1890s was fairly groundbreaking at that time. But the notion of a laboratory subject is the key here. 1890s are a particularly interesting point for me. The conception of writing and schooling as laboratories for teaching and learning was pervasive. It was an experimental era. In that decade, 1/4 of our country's population stared in awe at the technological marvels displayed at Chicago's Columbian Exposition, or World's Fair. And science innovation was seizing the public consciousness. I have many heroes from this era, and I'm going to tell you about a few of them. One was Preston Search. He was the superintendent of schools in Pueblo, Colorado in 1888, and later was superintendent in Los Angeles, California, and Holyoke, Massachusetts. He was at each of these places for a brief time because his ideas for reform were usually too expensive, and he then had to move on. He first presented his ideas on school reform in a series of articles in Educational Review, and he described his school as follows. The work is now conducted largely by what may be called laboratory methods, and he was one of the first ones to capture that terminology. Every room is a true studio or workshop in which the pupils work as individuals. The province of the teacher is not to line up the pupils and to consume time by entertainment, lecturing, and development of subjects, but to pass from desk to desk as the inspiring director and pupils' assistant. There's an aphorism in writing classes that we talk, the role of the teacher should move from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And I haven't been able to figure out the origins of that phrase, but I think in many ways it's just a variation of what Search said in that quote. Another hero from this era is a fellow by the name of John Kennedy, and he was the principal of the Batavia, New York school system. He looks kind of stern in that photo, but he sounded like he was a very interesting guy. So what he did in 1898 was as simple as adding an additional teacher to a classroom crowded with 53 children, which was fairly typical at the time. The second teacher's role, however, was, in Kennedy's words, to find the weak spots in the room and make them strong spots. And this is a picture of that room. It's a little hard to see because it's so grainy, but this is the teacher who's working individually with students on their writing, and while she's doing that, the rest of the students are reading or writing. And in the same room on the other side, this teacher is lecturing to all of these students who sort of have their heads down. And I think the contrast between activity and passivity is so interesting. And according to...
What's the date?
The date that it started was in 1898. And this quote was from, I think, 1901. His book came out in 1901. Individual attention involves no strain on the teacher and no violence to the pupil. Hence, it tends to that condition of repose and equipoise essential to good teaching and to successful study. And that's John Kennedy's quote. I'm not sure the Batavia, New York school system still looks like that. Somehow I doubt it. Another hero is a woman by the name of Helen Parkhurst, who created a system of schooling called the Dalton Laboratory Plan. And it was started in Dalton, Massachusetts, hence the name. She urged her readers to do the following, as I show in this quote. Let us think of school as a sociological laboratory where the pupils themselves are the experimenters, not the victims of an intricate and crystallized system. Let us think of it as a place where community conditions prevail, as they prevail in life itself. So, given these reform efforts, it would be easy to conclude that for teaching in general, and the teaching of writing in particular, student activity was key and that individual creative instruction would rule the day and many days thereafter. Well, not quite. Instead, the pressures of too many students, too little time and resources, and the easy retreat to status quo lecturing as a dominant mode of teaching stalled reform efforts. Another complicating factor for writing instruction was the persistent belief of writing abilities as a set of discrete skills that needed to be mastered in a building block approach. First words, then sentences, then paragraphs, finally whole essays. And that the less prepared needed to be quarantined in hospital English classes until their diseases were treated. That attitude was by no means isolated to open access institutions. I said I was going to pick on Yale, so here I am picking on Yale again. So here's the scene at Yale in 1929. There's practically no composition in the regular freshman English course at Yale. Each freshman does, however, early in the fall, write 3 short themes. On the evidence of these themes, plus the still more important evidence of the 10-minute quiz papers, which normally precede each recitation, freshmen who are considered deficient in writing are assigned to the awkward squad. Once in the squad, a man stays until he is cured. That is Yale, by the way. Skull and crossbones, you can see. I enjoyed distorting that picture, by the way. So the idea here, in many ways, even though there was a struggle at Yale whether to institute freshman composition. They eventually did. But in many places that did institute freshman composition, unfortunately, as I said in the title of this talk, it was often seen as inoculation. So whether it was an awkward squad effort or first-year writing requirement, the writing class came to be seen as a single solution, or even a simple solution in some ways, to a complex problem. But the ramifications of this attitude of writing class as inoculation are several. So one is the pathologizing of underprepared student writers as having a disease to be cured or students to be quarantined. And having looked at a lot of that teaching literature at the time, that language was prevalent and actually is still today. A second problem is the isolation of writing as a discrete skill or habit that's divorced from intellectual activity. My best example of that are grammar drill or drill and practice worksheets that are isolated away from real meaning making. And finally, the creation of an underclass of instructors relegated to killing work. And I'll give you a sense of where that quote comes from. There has been many studies of the burden on teachers. Once writing was identified as a laboratory subject and students needed to write, well, someone needed to respond to all that writing. There was a study by the MLA in 1909 and repeated about 20 years later. And this is a quote from Edwin Hopkins, who was the chair of that committee. Instructors wear out, suffer from indigestion and nervous exhaustion, lose their efficiency, impair their eyesight, become the prey of shattered nerves, break down, and find their way to the hospital or cemetery because of killing work in English composition. I give that to all of you who are grad students in RedCom. And Hopkins himself actually died from pretty much a nervous breakdown from his efforts at trying to get the profession to reform itself in lower class sizes. So I want to offer you an alternative. And an alternative view is writing class and writing itself as enculturation. In that it's a key activity in the education of all students. So some of the ramifications of this view include the view of writing as an essential meaning-making activity in any class. And the need to investigate how disciplines and professions use writing and develop communication skills. What does it mean to write in biology, anthropology, chemical engineering, history, sociology, botany, nursing, we can go down the list there. And finally, the view of writing, I have a typo, I'm so sorry. As a key component for students to participate in communities of practice. I'll have to talk to my proofreader about that. And so communities of practice is a key term I'm going to follow up on here. And it's an idea of thinking about the teaching and learning environment as a way for students to learn from each other, learn from expertise, share expertise, and do many other things. But here's a quote from Etienne Wenger. A community of practice is a living context that can give newcomers access to competence and also invite a personal experience of engagement by which to incorporate that competence into an identity of participation. Issues of identity become particularly important when thinking about the class and learning to write as a community of practice. And I'll highlight some of the key terms for me in Wenger's quote. Community of practice, engagement, and identity of participation. Those are the key ideas that I'm going to riff off of here in a second. Another kind of backbone to what I'm talking about here is the notion of writing and learning as connected activities, as the idea of learning to write and writing to learn. And I really like this quote from Paul Connolly. This is from a book about writing in math and science, actually. Language, oral or written, is an expressive instrument through which we communicate what we have previously thought, writing to communicate. It is also the reflective instrument through which we think alone with others about what we are doing. So writing to learn. And it's a very powerful tool for that. In addition to the benefits students gain by becoming skilled writers, the use of writing as a way of achieving our goals as teachers can dramatically alter our classrooms and alter our relationships to students. Using writing in our teaching belies notions of passive students soaking up the content of our fields as they sit wrapped before our lectures. What Paulo Freire terms the banking model of education, as knowledge is somehow deposited into students' heads, and then its receipt signaled by the use of guess the answer exams. And Mark's going to hold up Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed now as a visual aid. Thank you. Teaching with writing requires us to reflect on how we define student learning, how that definition can be found in our course goals, and how writing might be used as a way of enacting those goals. We hear consistent and strong messages about how writing is much more than an instrument to be mastered, akin to a pen or a keyboard. And we hear consistent and strong messages about how the economy of the 21st century requires our students to be skilled communicators. As manufacturing jobs continue to erode and more opportunities are created in the service sector, students who are strong writers and speakers will be in demand. Another key aspect of using writing in our classes is the relationship between writing and engagement. In Richard Light's studies at Harvard, he found that engagement, that writing was the key variable among the many he studied. So let me give you a sense of what he said. The relationship between the amount of writing for a course and students' level of engagement, whether engagement is measured by time spent on the course or the intellectual challenge it presents or students' self-reported interest in it, is stronger than any relationship we found between student engagement and any other course characteristic. And one more quote to follow up on that. That relationship was stronger than the relationship between student engagement and class size. It is far stronger than the relationship between level of engagement and why a student chooses a course, required versus elective, major field versus not in the major field. The writing itself was that strong variable. So let me personalize this a bit for me and how these ideas kind of come to fruition both in my teaching and in my research. I'm most interested in what the role of professional identity is for students learning to write and speak as scientists and engineers. I'm trying to connect some of the dots that I've been kind of laying out for you. Many make persuasive arguments about the learning and identity formation as being intertwined. And this quote from James G. is a good one for me. Knowing is a matter of being able to participate centrally in practice, and learning is a matter of changing patterns of participation with concomitant changes in identity. Hard word to say. So that idea of identity, practice, and change being all wrapped up is what's key here. I have an example of identity here, given my MIT context, from Gary Larson. It's time we face reality, my friends. We're not exactly rocket scientists. I like that. It's the third or fourth time I've shown this. The first time I got that laugh, by the way. I'm testing whether I should keep this slide. So what do these conceptions mean for writing and speaking instruction? And I think John Bean lays out a wonderful challenge for us all. The use of writing in our classes is ideally about creating opportunities for students to have an authentic desire to converse with interested readers about real ideas. What might our classes or our teaching situations or our learning contexts look like if the goal is to create those kinds of opportunities? And I lay that out for you. One way to also think about it is the idea of authentic activities, and the idea of learning as an authentic situation is key to a lot of what I've been talking about, and in the pre-professional environments that I work in is very powerful, actually. So authentic activity is important for learners because it is the only way they gain access to the standpoint that enables practitioners to act meaningfully and purposefully, according to some of the folks who look at this kind of work. So let me tell you about MIT and kind of set the scene for it. I've been talking in maybe a bit of a theoretical way, but I want to make things a bit more practical. And I'm throwing around acronyms, so I want to make sure you're all copacetic with some of this terminology. So WAC usually means writing across the curriculum, and that acronym has a long history. It acknowledges the centrality and importance of writing to our view of an educated person. But there's been some unhappiness with that term. Maybe it's not specific enough, and maybe WID is a better acronym, writing in the disciplines. And that's an acknowledgement that important disciplinary differences need to be accounted for, and that writing is bundled with knowledge production and communication in any of our disciplines. Or what are the borders of this? But some folks think that the disciplinary borders maybe aren't sufficient. So there's been movement in the last couple of years that hasn't caught on very well to use WIM. Something doesn't have a good ring to it, I think. But writing in the majors, and that's an acknowledgement that boundaries might be better drawn, not along disciplinary lines, which can be hard to draw, but along the lines of a major field of study, which is generally how colleges and universities are organized anyway. But the problem with all three of those is actually, it's not just writing that we're talking about, it's communication more broadly. Writing, speaking, use of visuals. And so CXC, or communication across the curriculum, is an acknowledgement that it's not just writing, but communication more broadly. And CAC doesn't really work, so we're not going to even go there with CAC. That was a joke, by the way. So let me give you a sense of the history at MIT in terms of these acronyms. So we start with WAC at MIT, but it's not just across the curriculum. It's not really organized that way. It's not just writing. And it is more of a disciplinary nature in terms of what we're looking at. But we have the same issues that I just pointed out with that glossary, so that doesn't work. Really, we're a communications program and a communications requirement. So perhaps it should be SID at MIT, but that doesn't work either because it is really organized along the major lines, so maybe it should be SIM at MIT. But that, I don't know, that doesn't seem good, so we just call it WAC at MIT. So there it is, WAC at MIT. So let me tell you a bit about WAC at MIT. All undergraduates have to take 4 communications-intensive classes. It's a requirement for graduation. 2 of those are in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. They're known as CIHs. And 2 of them are in their majors, known as CIMs. The classes that are these CI classes have instructional support from the writing program, which is what I work for. And kind of 2 different arms of that. The CIMs primarily are supported by WAC lecturers, and I'm one of those. There are about 20 of us full-time, actually, who support CIMs. And the support looks like various things. I teach, I'll show you in a second, actually, a standalone scientific communications class that's associated with a biology lab class. In other classes, I'm more embedded, where I do workshops and respond to student writing. And some I'm a little more removed, and I just look at some student writing and I never actually meet the students. So varying models depending upon the class, the department, the instructor. It's quite flexible in lots of ways. That's the front end of our website. If you click on any of those links, it takes you really nowhere. We need to do a lot of website development. So what we want to do in many ways is counter some prevailing notions of what it means to write like a scientist and engineer, and that's one. I like showing this one when the audience are scientists and engineering faculty, and I go, I know what that's like. And to put it in another perspective, what we try to do, and in particular what I try to do, is think about science as far more, as students writing of science, as far more than simply if they do really good scientific work, an experiment's successful, then they're good to go. But it's writing of science is a persuasive act, like any writing. And I use this essay by Michael Halloran, which he analyzes, does a rhetorical analysis of Watson and Crick's 1953 groundbreaking structure of DNA paper. Given James Watson's recent comments, I was thinking I need a red thingy through him. If you don't know that, you can Google James Watson, see what you get. But what Halloran says about that Watson and Crick paper, I think, is particularly powerful. It's the paper is an initial move in a rhetorical strategy aimed at gaining and holding the attention of an audience. As such, it presumes an understanding of science as a human community in which neither facts nor ideas speak for themselves, and the attention of the audience must be courted. So writing science as rhetorical act is essentially what we try to impress upon our students. A little bit more about the specifics of some of the work that I do. And the reason I was thinking about this, the reason I'm showing you this is to show you the work I do. But to see that if biology and biological engineering are incorporating writing in their classes in this way, why not courses in the humanities, arts, and social sciences in some ways, or general education more broadly? If we can done in these highly disciplinary classes, why not in other classes? So one class I've worked with since I was hired, I was actually hired to create this class, is a scientific communications class. It's attached to a molecular biology lab class. The students are generally sophomore biology majors. And we love numbers at MIT, so the class is called 702. And that semester was cross-listed with chemical engineering, which is course 10. And so it was 702/10702. But in this class, it's changed a bit over the years, but we generally teaching students to write scientific articles. And we have several meetings over the semester, each focused on a different aspect of an article: intro, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, figures, abstract, title. And students are writing up the lab work that they're doing into scientific article format. It's presented interesting challenges this semester because they've changed the experimental work that students are doing, and nothing worked, essentially. The results were, didn't work. So writing it up, and all students say, we really wouldn't write this up for publication, would we? Because it didn't work. We're like, no, it's not an authentic activity from that point of view. But you're going to learn a lot by writing this up. The other class that I work with most frequently, including this semester, is biological engineering, course 20. And this class is a really, really interesting class. I've actually studied it as well as being the writing person attached to it. What's interesting about it is students are doing groundbreaking experimental work, and things often don't work, like in the biology class, and having students deal with that. Biological engineering is also the newest major at MIT, so there's a real kind of fervor among students in this class that they're part of something new, and it's a very new field with lots of interesting directions. In this class, they're doing things, one of the first experiment modules, they're refactoring a virus. In other words, they're building a virus from the ground up, from the DNA sequence up. Interesting work. Disturbing, too. And what's interesting about it, for me in this class, is there's 2 papers and 2 oral presentations. And if you added all that up, they constitute 80% of the students' grade, those activities. They're in lab twice a week. They're in lecture twice a week. They're in recitation once or twice a week. They have many things to do. But the message is, if you can't write up your science, it's not worth much. Or communicate your science, since they give talks as well. So I want you to think about your stepping stones. I'm going to loop back as I come to the end of my talk. And I want you to consider these questions. Did your stepping stone take place in school or outside of it? Was a significant influence a teacher, a peer, a family member, or another adult? And maybe the most important question I can ask you to think about, to take away from this session, is what did you learn about writing? And what did you learn about learning? And what did you learn about yourself from that significant moment? And I just want you to think about that. Let me end with this quote. There have been many commissions and task forces of various sorts on a national, federal level to look at writing and to critique the importance of writing and writing instruction. And I like this particular quote. At best, writing has helped transform the world. Revolutions have been started by it. Oppression has been toppled by it. And it has enlightened the human condition. And that's why we need to continue doing the work that we're doing. Thank you all.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Your attendance here is, documenting your attendance here is important to us. So please make sure you signed in and turn in the evaluation form. If you're joining us in the internet, there's a little online evaluation form. That's how we know you've watched it. If you've stuck with us this long, you can fill that out evaluation form. I would appreciate it. And I'd like for everybody to please join me in thanking our speaker. I thought this was really great. There might be a class coming in here, so...
Nope, let's get out of here.
Take some cookies on. Appreciate it. I enjoyed
Thank you.
a large part of it from...